Imagine spending 40 years believing you're fundamentally broken. You're intelligent. Everyone tells you so. You can talk for hours about subjects that fascinate you, absorb entire books in single sittings, solve problems others can't see. But you can't remember to pay bills. You lose your keys 3 times a day. You start 20 projects and finish none. You're always late despite setting 7 alarms. Your home is chaos, your relationships are strained, and deep in your bones you believe there's something wrong with you, something lazy, careless, defective. Then, at 43, sitting in a psychiatrist's office, you hear 3 words that detonate your entire understanding of reality. You have ADHD. Wait, ADHD? Isn't that the hyperactive kid bouncing off classroom walls? You were never hyperactive. You were the daydreamer, the spacey one, the girl staring out to the window. How could you have ADHD your entire life and never know? But here's what makes this moment truly extraordinary. And here's what almost no one understands about ADHD. You've been living with a different neurological operating system this whole time. Every failure, every character flaw, every moment you blamed yourself for not trying hard enough was your brain trying to navigate a world designed for someone else's hardware. Tonight, we're going deep into something that will challenge everything you think you know. Because what if ADHD isn't actually a disorder? What if the same traits that make modern life impossibly difficult might have kept our ancestors alone? What if the brains we've been trying to fix are actually part of humanity's cognitive diversity? Different, challenging, yes, but also capable of remarkable things that neurotypical brains simply cannot do? By the end of this journey, you'll discover a twist that reframes the entire story of ADHD. We're not just exploring a medical condition, we're uncovering a hidden architecture in how human minds work and why some of us experience reality in a fundamentally different way. So settle in, breathe. What you're about to hear might change how you understand yourself or someone you love forever. Part 1. The clinical picture. What ADHD actually is. Let's start with what we know from decades of research, because before we can talk about neurodiversity, strengths, or paradigm shifts, we need to understand what ADHD actually is from a clinical perspective. Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, or ADHD, is classified in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, the DSM-5, as a neurodevelopmental condition. This classification matters. It tells us that ADHD begins in childhood, that it involves the way the brain develops and functions, and that it affects fundamental cognitive processes. The DSM-5, published in 2013 by the American Psychiatric Association, made several significant changes to how ADHD is diagnosed in adults. These weren't arbitrary adjustments. They reflected decades of research showing that ADHD doesn't simply disappear when you turn 18, and that the way it manifests can shift across the lifespan. Here's what the criteria tell us. To receive an ADHD diagnosis as an adult, you need to show at least 5 symptoms from either the inattentive domain or the hyperactive impulsive domain, or both. In children under 17, that number is 6. This adjustment came from research demonstrating that adults may show fewer overt symptoms while still experiencing significant impairment. The brain matures, compensation strategies develop, but the underlying differences remain. The symptoms must have been present before age 12. This is another change. Previously, it was age 7. Researchers found that many legitimate cases of ADHD, particularly in girls and women, didn't become problematic until later childhood, when academic and social demands increased. The age extension acknowledges this reality. These symptoms must appear in 2 or more settings: home, work, school, social situations. They must reduce the quality of functioning in these areas. And crucially, they cannot be better explained by another mental health condition. Let's look at what these symptoms actually are, because the language matters. In the inattentive presentation, we see patterns like this. Often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in work or other activities. Often has difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or leisure activities. Often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly. Often does not follow through on instructions and fails to finish work, chores, or duties. Often has difficulty organizing tasks and activities. Often avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to engage in tasks requiring sustained mental effort. Often loses things necessary for tasks or activities. Is often easily distracted by extraneous stimuli. Is often forgetful in daily activities. Read that list, and you might think, doesn't everyone experience some of these things sometimes? And yes, that's true. The difference lies in frequency, severity, and impact. For someone with ADHD, these aren't occasional lapses. They're pervasive patterns that have existed since childhood and that significantly interfere with life functioning, despite the person's best efforts to overcome them. The hyperactive impulsive presentation looks different, often fidgets with or taps hands or feet, or squirms in seat. Often leaves seat in situations when remaining seated is expected. Often runs about or climbs in situations where it's inappropriate, though in adults this often manifests as internal restlessness rather than literal climbing. Often unable to engage in leisure activities quietly. Is often on the go, acting as if driven by a motor. Often talks excessively. Often blurts out answers before questions have been completed. Often has trouble waiting their turn. Often interrupts or intrudes on others. Here's where it gets interesting, though. Many adults with ADHD have learned to suppress external hyperactivity. They don't literally run around conference rooms. But that doesn't mean the hyperactivity is gone. Research has increasingly recognized that hyperactivity can turn inward, manifesting as racing thoughts, constant mental restlessness, an inability to quiet the mind, intense rumination, and anxiety. This internalized hyperactivity is harder to see, but just as real, and it may help explain why ADHD and anxiety disorders so frequently co-occur. The combined presentation simply means you meet criteria for both inattentive and hyperactive impulsive symptoms. And here's something crucial that the research tells us. These presentations can change over time. A child diagnosed with predominantly hyperactive impulsive type might, by adulthood, meet criteria only for inattentive type. The DSM-5 actually changed the terminology from subtypes to presentations to reflect this fluidity. You don't have a fixed type of ADHD. You have a presentation that represents your current symptom profile, which may shift as you age and as your environment changes. The DSM-5 also added severity specifiers, mild, moderate, or severe, based on the degree of functional impairment. And critically, it added the option to code ADHD as in partial remission if you previously met full criteria, but now have fewer symptoms while still experiencing some impairment. This matters for adults who've developed coping strategies who are in treatment. You don't suddenly not have ADHD because you've learned to function better. One more significant change. The DSM-5 now allows for a diagnosis of both ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, which was previously prohibited. This reflects growing recognition that these conditions can co-occur, and that prohibiting dual diagnosis was preventing people from getting accurate assessments and appropriate support. Now, here's what's not in the DSM-5, but what clinical experience and research consistently show. ADHD involves profound difficulties with what neuroscientists call executive functions. The DSM focuses on observable behaviors: attention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. But beneath these surface symptoms lies something deeper, a difference in how the brain's executive control systems develop and operate. Before we explore that, though, we need to address something that affects millions of adults: the experience of late diagnosis and why so many people, especially women, spend decades not knowing they have ADHD. Part 2. The Lost Girls. Late diagnosis and hidden ADHD. Sarah was 57 when she was finally diagnosed with ADHD. She'd spent her entire adult life believing she was fundamentally flawed. She was a successful therapist, helping others navigate their struggles while privately drowning in her own. Her home was chronically disorganized. She was always late, despite setting multiple alarms. She'd lose her keys, her phone, her train of thought mid-conversation. She'd start 10 projects and finish none. Her colleagues saw her as scattered, but brilliant. Her family saw her as unreliable. She saw herself as lazy and inadequate. Then her daughter was diagnosed with ADHD at age 12, and Sarah started reading about the condition. With each paragraph, something clicked. By the time she sought her own evaluation, she was both devastated and relieved. Sarah's story isn't unusual. Research published in 2023 tells us that women with ADHD experience, on average, a nearly 4-year delay in diagnosis compared to men, receiving their diagnosis at a mean age of 23.5 years versus 19.6 years for men. And those are just the people who eventually get diagnosed. Many never do. The statistics paint a striking picture. In childhood, the ratio of boys to girls diagnosed with ADHD is approximately 3-to-1, and some studies suggest it may be as high as 17-to-1 in certain populations. But in adulthood, that ratio narrows dramatically, approaching 1-to-1. This doesn't mean girls spontaneously develop ADHD as they grow up. It means they had it all along, but no one noticed. Why? The answer is complex, involving research bias, societal expectations, symptom presentation differences, and something called masking. For decades, ADHD research focused primarily on boys. The diagnostic criteria were developed based on how ADHD manifests in males, who are more likely to show the hyperactive, impulsive presentation. Boys with ADHD are more likely to be disruptive in class, to get in trouble, to show behaviors that demand adult attention. These are the squeaky wheels that get the diagnostic grease. Girls and women with ADHD, by contrast, are more likely to have the inattentive presentation. They're the daydreamers staring out the window, the students whose minds wander but who don't cause trouble. They're disorganized, forgetful, struggling internally, but they're not disruptive. They're suffering quietly. And then there's masking, a term borrowed from autism research but equally applicable to ADHD. Masking means learning to hide your symptoms, to compensate, to appear normal through enormous, exhausting effort. Girls and women are socialized from an early age to be accommodating, organized, attentive to others' needs, emotionally regulated. They face more pressure to conform to social expectations, so they develop elaborate coping strategies. They might set dozens of reminders, create complex organizational systems, stay up late finishing work they couldn't focus on during the day, rehearse conversations, copy others' behavior to fit in, control impulses through sheer willpower, even as it drains them. From the outside, they appear fine, perhaps a little scattered, maybe type A, and anxious but functioning. Inside, they're exhausted from the constant effort of holding themselves together. This masking comes at a cost. Research. published in 2023 in Scientific Reports, explored the adverse experiences of women with undiagnosed ADHD and found something striking. Participants commonly reported internalizing criticism and described disconcertingly low self-esteem, citing guilt, shame, and negative self-perception directly resulting from delayed diagnoses. They blamed themselves for struggles that were actually neurological. They felt they were failing at being women, at keeping tidy homes, remembering social obligations, managing family schedules, all the invisible labor that society assigns to women. The study found that diagnosis was revelatory for these women. Their lives finally made sense. One participant described it as years of self-blame suddenly lifting. Another said, "I spent 40 years thinking I was just lazy and stupid." The diagnosis didn't give them ADHD, they'd always had it, but it gave them a framework to understand themselves with compassion instead of shame. Late diagnosis has concrete consequences beyond psychological distress. Research shows that women with late diagnosed ADHD have higher rates of anxiety and depression, higher rates of hospitalization for psychiatric issues, more suicide attempts, and greater overall impairment in quality of life. The delay isn't benign. There's also evidence suggesting that many women with late diagnosed ADHD had prior contact with mental health services for years before receiving the correct diagnosis. They were treated for depression, for anxiety, sometimes for borderline personality disorder, addressing symptoms without recognizing the underlying ADHD. This is called diagnostic overshadowing. One condition eclipses the possibility of another. A woman comes in with severe anxiety and depression, and the clinician treats those conditions, never considering that unmanaged ADHD might be contributing to or even causing the mood disturbance. Here's something the research suggests we consider. Treating ADHD can actually prevent the development of comorbid conditions. A 10-year longitudinal study by Biderman and colleagues in 2009 found that young people with ADHD who were treated with stimulants had significantly lower rates of depression and anxiety disorders as adults compared to those who weren't treated. Early intervention doesn't just manage ADHD symptoms, it may alter the trajectory of psychiatric morbidity across the lifespan. But many women don't get that early intervention. They get decades of struggling, of being told they're too sensitive, too emotional, not trying hard enough. They develop secondary mental health issues from years of coping with undiagnosed ADHD. By the time they're finally diagnosed, there's often significant psychological damage to repair. And it's not just women. While gender disparities in diagnosis are striking, plenty of men also go undiagnosed into adulthood, particularly if they have the inattentive presentation, particularly if they're intelligent enough to compensate, particularly if they're in structured environments that minimize their difficulties. The average age of diagnosis for adults who weren't diagnosed as children, according to survey data published in 2024, is around 39 years. That's 4 decades of life lived without understanding why certain things feel so impossibly hard. Many people first suspect they have ADHD when their child is diagnosed. They read about the symptoms, the genetic component, and suddenly their own life makes sense. Others discover it through social media, where adults with ADHD share their experiences. There's been criticism of TikTok diagnosis and concerns about over-identification. But there's also a valid point. Traditional diagnostic pathways failed these people for decades. Social media gave them information they never got from medical professionals. The question we might consider is this: how many people are still out there, still undiagnosed, still believing they're fundamentally flawed, when what they actually have is a neurodevelopmental condition that's treatable, manageable, and understandable? And what would change for them if they knew? Part 3. The orchestra without a conductor. Executive function. To understand what ADHD actually feels like from the inside, we need to talk about executive functions. This term was coined in the 1970s by researcher Carl Pribram, whose work indicated that these functions are mediated primarily by the prefrontal cortex, the brain's command center. Think of executive functions as the CEO of your brain, the conductor of your mental orchestra. They're the cognitive processes that allow you to pursue goals, regulate behavior, make plans, and execute them. They let you hold information in mind while working with it, inhibit impulses, switch between tasks, start things even when you don't feel like it, organize your approach to complex problems, and regulate your emotions. Here's the key insight. ADHD isn't fundamentally about attention. It's about executive dysfunction. Russell Barkley, one of the leading ADHD researchers, has identified 7 key executive functions that develop across childhood and into early adulthood: self-awareness, inhibition, working memory, emotional self-regulation, self-motivation, planning and problem-solving, and what he calls motor control and fluency. These develop in a generally chronological order, with self-awareness starting around age 2 and planning and problem-solving typically fully developed by age 30 in neurotypical individuals. But here's what Barkley's research tells us. Those with ADHD are generally about 30 to 40% behind their peers in developing these executive functions. A 30-year-old with ADHD might have the executive function capacity of someone in their early 20s. This isn't a moral judgment, it's neurodevelopment. Let's break down what this looks like in real life. Working memory is your ability to hold information in mind and manipulate it. It's what lets you remember the first part of a sentence while you're reading the end of it. It lets you keep track of multiple steps in a complex task. It allows you to remember what someone just said while formulating your response. In ADHD, working memory is often significantly impaired. You forget what you were saying mid-sentence. You walk into a room and have no idea why you went there. You read a page and realize you absorbed nothing. You're given instructions and they evaporate before you can act on them. Inhibition is your brain's brake system. It lets you stop yourself from blurting things out, from acting on impulses, from getting distracted by every interesting thing around you. When inhibition is impaired, you interrupt people not because you're rude, but because you literally cannot hold the thought until they're done talking. You'll forget it if you wait. You buy things impulsively because the impulse to purchase doesn't trigger a wait and consider response. You switch tasks constantly because every new stimulus captures your attention and you lack the inhibitory control to stay focused on what you started. Planning and organization involve breaking down complex tasks into steps, putting those steps in order, and executing them sequentially. With impaired executive function, this breaks down. You know you need to do your taxes, but you can't break that big, nebulous task into concrete steps. You want to clean your house, but you can't figure out where to start. You have 10 things to do and no clear sense of priority. The task of making a plan itself requires executive function, so asking someone with ADHD to just get organized is like asking someone with poor vision to just see better. Emotional regulation is the ability to modulate your emotional responses, to pause between feeling and reacting. Many adults with ADHD describe emotional dysregulation as one of their most challenging symptoms, even though it's not officially listed in the DSM. They feel emotions intensely and have trouble controlling their reactions. Small frustrations feel enormous. Rejection or criticism can be devastating. Joy can be overwhelming. This isn't melodrama. It's impaired emotional executive function. Task initiation is the ability to start doing something, especially when it's boring or difficult. This is where the ADHD experience diverges sharply from the neurotypical experience in a way that's hard to explain. It's not laziness. It's not lack of motivation in the usual sense. It's a neurological difficulty with converting intention into action when the task doesn't provide immediate reward or stimulation. You can want desperately to do something, know you need to do it, feel terrible about not doing it, and still be completely unable to start. Executive dysfunction means the start button is broken. Now here's where it gets really interesting. These executive function deficits don't affect all tasks equally. That's why ADHD can look paradoxical. How can someone who can't focus spend 8 hours straight on a video game? How can someone who can't get organized manage complex projects at work but can't pay their bills on time? The answer involves something called interest-based nervous system. For tasks that are interesting, novel, urgent, or competitive, the ADHD brain can suddenly focus with laser intensity. This is called hyperfocus, and it's not really about attention at all. It's about the brain finally getting the stimulation it needs to engage its executive systems. The ADHD brain has difficulty with dopamine regulation, though we should note that the exact mechanisms remain debated among researchers. The prevailing hypothesis suggests that ADHD may involve either reduced dopamine availability or altered dopamine receptor functioning in key brain regions, particularly the prefrontal cortex and striatum. This theory would help explain why stimulant medications, which increase dopamine activity, prove effective for many people with ADHD, though it's worth noting that this doesn't definitively prove the dopamine deficit theory. Effectiveness doesn't necessarily confirm the underlying mechanism. When a task provides enough intrinsic reward, novelty, urgency, or interest, research suggests it can generate sufficient neural activity to overcome executive function difficulties. Suddenly, focus becomes possible, sometimes too much focus. People with ADHD describe losing hours to something interesting, forgetting to eat, missing appointments, unable to disengage. That's hyperfocus, and it's both a strength and a challenge. It's a strength when directed at something productive. It's a challenge when you hyperfocus on researching ancient Rome for 6 hours instead of finishing the work presentation due tomorrow. This is why just try harder doesn't work for ADHD. The executive systems that enable trying are themselves impaired. It's not a question of effort. It's a question of whether your brain's command and control systems are functioning optimally. Research using neuroimaging has identified differences in brain structure and function in people with ADHD. Several circuits in the prefrontal cortex show altered connectivity and activation patterns. The anterior cingulate cortex, involved in error detection and attention allocation, shows differences. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, crucial for working memory and planning, shows differences. The connections between these regions and other brain areas, particularly the striatum, show differences. These aren't massive structural abnormalities. They're subtle differences in how the brain is wired and how it functions. But those subtle differences have profound effects on daily life. Here's what a meta-analysis by Willcutt and colleagues in 2005 found. Compared to controls, adults with ADHD show medium effect sizes in executive function impairments, with particular difficulties in verbal, fluency, inhibition, and set shifting. But interestingly, the study also found deficits in non-executive domains, like response variability and processing speed. This suggests ADHD involves more than just executive dysfunction. There are broader cognitive differences at play. The executive function model of ADHD is powerful and useful, but it's not complete. It doesn't explain everything about the ADHD experience. As we'll see, there might be other ways to understand what's happening in these different brains. Part 4. The Web of Comorbidity, when ADHD doesn't come alone. Here's something that research has consistently shown. If you have ADHD, there's a high probability you have something else as well. About 70% of adults with ADHD have at least one other mental health condition. This isn't coincidence. It's the rule rather than the exception. The most common comorbidities are anxiety disorders and depression. Studies suggest that up to 50% of people with ADHD experience anxiety disorders at some point in their lives. For depression, estimates range from about 19% to 53%, depending on the population studied and the criteria used. These are remarkably high rates. Why? The relationship between ADHD and these conditions is complex and bidirectional, and researchers are still working to understand the mechanisms. One possibility that researchers have explored is shared genetic and neurobiological vulnerabilities. ADHD, anxiety, and depression all involve altered neurotransmitter function, particularly in dopamine and serotonin systems. They all involve activity differences in similar brain regions: the prefrontal cortex, limbic system, and reward circuits. Based on this overlap, scientists have hypothesized that whatever genetic or developmental factors contribute to ADHD might also increase susceptibility to mood and anxiety disorders, though the exact mechanisms remain under investigation. Another possibility, supported by longitudinal research, is that anxiety and depression can develop as psychological consequences of living with unmanaged ADHD. Consider the lived experience. Spending your entire life feeling like you're failing at tasks everyone else manages easily. Chronic underachievement despite high intelligence. Damaged relationships from forgotten commitments and impulsive words. The constant stress of scrambling to meet deadlines, pay bills on time, remember appointments. Research on stress and mental health would predict that this chronic experience of falling short would take a psychological toll, and indeed, that's what studies have found. Research supports this interpretation. The study by Biderman mentioned earlier found that treating ADHD with stimulants in adolescence significantly reduced the likelihood of developing depression and anxiety in adulthood. This suggests that, at least in some cases, the mood and anxiety issues are downstream effects of ADHD, rather than independent conditions. Then there's the possibility of diagnostic confusion. ADHD and anxiety can look similar. Both involve difficulty concentrating, both can cause restlessness, both can impair functioning. Depression can cause executive dysfunction, attention problems, and low motivation that mimic ADHD. Clinicians might diagnose anxiety or depression because those are more familiar conditions, missing the underlying ADHD. But sometimes they truly co-occur as independent conditions, each making the other worse. Anxiety amplifies ADHD symptoms. It's hard to focus when you're anxious. ADHD amplifies anxiety. When you keep making mistakes and forgetting things, your anxiety naturally increases. The two conditions can create a vicious cycle. This matters for treatment. If someone comes in with depression and undiagnosed ADHD, treating only the depression might provide limited benefit. SSRIs won't address executive function deficits or attention problems. The person might feel less acutely sad, but still struggle with the functional impairments that contributed to their depression in the first place. On the other hand, treating ADHD alone might not resolve a true comorbid anxiety disorder. The clinical implication is that comprehensive assessment is essential. When someone presents with depression or anxiety, clinicians should consider whether there might be underlying ADHD. And when someone presents with ADHD, clinicians should assess for mood and anxiety disorders. Beyond anxiety and depression, ADHD frequently co-occurs with other conditions. Substance use disorders occur at elevated rates, which might reflect self-medication attempts, using alcohol or drugs to calm racing thoughts or manage emotional dysregulation. Sleep disorders are common, partly because ADHD affects the brain's ability to regulate arousal and settle into sleep. Eating disorders, particularly binge eating disorder and bulimia, show elevated rates in ADHD populations, possibly related to impulsivity and emotional dysregulation. There's also significant overlap with autism spectrum disorder, something that wasn't recognized until relatively recently, since the DSM prohibited dual diagnosis until 2013. Many individuals show traits of both conditions, experiencing both the social communication differences characteristic of autism and the attention and executive function challenges characteristic of ADHD. Some researchers have proposed that we should think less in terms of distinct diagnostic categories and more in terms of dimensional traits that cluster together in different ways in different people. Instead of having ADHD or autism or anxiety, you might have a particular profile of traits spanning attention, executive function, sensory processing, social cognition, and emotional regulation. This dimensional approach might better reflect reality than our current categorical diagnostic system. What's clear is that ADHD rarely exists in isolation. The web of comorbidity is part of the clinical picture, and effective treatment must address the whole constellation of symptoms rather than focusing narrowly on ADHD alone. But there's another way to think about all of this. What if we stepped back from the language of disorders and comorbidities and asked a different question? What if ADHD isn't fundamentally a medical problem? What if it's a different way of being human? Part 5. The Neurodiversity Paradigm. Rethinking Difference. In 1990, an Australian sociologist named Judy Singer coined the term neurodiversity. She was part of the early autistic rights movement, and she was looking for language that would frame neurological differences not as deficits, but as natural variations in human cognitive and neurological functioning. The core idea is elegant. Just as biodiversity is essential for a healthy ecosystem, neurodiversity is essential for a healthy society. Different kinds of minds bring different strengths, different ways of processing information, different perspectives on problems. What we call developmental disorders might better be understood as natural variations that have always existed in our species and that likely served adaptive functions in different contexts. In 1998, building on Singer's work, autistic activists began organizing online through forums like the Autism Network International. They pushed back against the dominant medical model, which viewed autism primarily through the lens of deficits and sought cures. Instead, they argued for acceptance, accommodation, and recognition of autistic people's rights and dignity. By 2012, philosopher and autistic scholar Nick Walker proposed a more formal framework, the neurodiversity paradigm. Walker distinguished this from the pathology paradigm that had dominated psychiatry and clinical psychology. The pathology paradigm assumes there's one normal, healthy, optimal way for brains to develop and function. Deviations from this norm are disorders, pathologies, deficits to be corrected. The goal of medicine is to make atypical brains more like typical ones. The neurodiversity paradigm proposes something different. Neurological diversity is a natural and valuable form of human diversity. There is no single normal or healthy type of brain, just as there's no single normal or healthy gender, race, or culture. The challenges neurodivergent people face arise largely from living in environments designed for neurotypical functioning, not from their neurology itself. Let's be precise about what this does and doesn't mean, because the neurodiversity paradigm is sometimes misunderstood or oversimplified. It doesn't mean that ADHD isn't real or doesn't cause difficulties. It doesn't mean people don't need support, accommodations, or treatment. It doesn't deny that executive dysfunction is challenging or that ADHD can be genuinely disabling in certain contexts. What it does mean is reframing the fundamental question. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with this brain?" we ask, "How does this brain work, and what environments allow it to thrive?" Instead of focusing solely on deficits, we recognize that different cognitive styles have different strengths and weaknesses. The neurodiversity paradigm has been particularly embraced by autistic self-advocates, but it's increasingly applied to ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and other neurodevelopmental conditions. For people with ADHD, this framework can be liberating. It shifts the narrative from "I'm broken and need to be fixed" to "I'm different and need support, accommodation, and strategies that work with how my brain operates." There's even an evolutionary argument for neurodiversity. Though we should be clear, this remains a hypothesis rather than established fact. Some researchers have proposed that ADHD traits might have been adaptive in ancestral environments. This is sometimes called the hunter-gatherer hypothesis. And while we can't travel back in time to test it directly, the logic is intriguing. Consider this. For most of human history, over 200,000 years, we lived in small hunter-gatherer groups. Modern agricultural and industrial society represents only the last 10,000 years, barely 5% of our species' existence. Our brains evolved primarily in that earlier context, not in modern offices and classrooms. Now, what traits might have served someone well in a hunter-gatherer environment? The ability to notice small movements and sounds across a wide field of attention, what we now call distractibility in a classroom, might have been crucial vigilance on the savannah. High energy and physical restlessness, valuable for tracking game over vast distances, less so for sitting at a desk for 8 hours. Quick reaction times and impulsivity, potentially life-saving when a predator appears suddenly. The capacity to hyper-focus intensely on interesting tasks. Imagine tracking prey for hours with unwavering concentration. Creativity and unconventional thinking, essential for solving novel survival challenges when tried and true methods failed. This interpretation would suggest that ADHD traits become disordered, mainly in the context of modern environments. The same brain that struggles with paperwork and meetings might have excelled at tasks requiring constant environmental scanning, bursts of intense activity, rapid decision-making, and innovative problem-solving. We should acknowledge the limitations of this hypothesis. We can't directly observe how ADHD individuals functioned in prehistoric societies. The genetic variants associated with ADHD today might have had different effects in different environments. And not all ADHD traits map neatly onto hunter-gatherer activities. Still, the evolutionary perspective offers a useful reframe. Perhaps these aren't broken brains, but differently specialized brains, optimized for a different ecological niche than the one modern society demands. A 2023 paper published in the journal Neuropsychology explored this idea from a different angle, noting that natural selection can maintain genetic subgroups within a species that thrive in specialized niches. The authors pointed out that human evolution has selected for specialized minds, and that modern economies run on division of labor, something that may reflect our long evolutionary history of social niche specialization. Their argument suggests that cognitive diversity itself might have been advantageous for group survival. If we apply this framework to ADHD, we might imagine that in a hunter-gatherer group of 50 people, having 2 or 3 individuals with ADHD-type traits could have benefited the whole community. These individuals might have naturally gravitated toward roles requiring constant vigilance, like sentries who notice approaching threats, or sustained tracking abilities, like hunters who could follow prey with intense focus for hours, or innovative problem-solving, like toolmakers who experimented with unconventional approaches when standard methods failed. Meanwhile, individuals with different cognitive profiles would fill complementary roles, perhaps those with strong executive function and attention to detail, managing food storage, remembering complex kinship relations, or planning seasonal movements. This remains theoretical. We can't test it directly, and archaeological evidence doesn't tell us about cognitive styles. But it provides a framework for understanding ADHD as difference rather than pure deficit. The traits exist in modern populations at stable rates across cultures, which is consistent with their being maintained by selection rather than gradually disappearing as purely harmful variants would. The neurodiversity movement emphasizes accommodations and systemic changes over medical interventions aimed at normalization. This doesn't mean rejecting medication. Many neurodiversity advocates use medication and find it helpful. Rather, it means questioning the assumption that the goal should be to make neurodivergent people function exactly like neurotypical people. Instead, the focus shifts to questions like, what accommodations allow people with ADHD to thrive? What changes to education and workplace practices would support different learning and working styles? How can we build environments that work for neurological diversity rather than demanding everyone fit one narrow template? Critics of the neurodiversity paradigm sometimes argue that it downplays genuine suffering and disability. Someone with severe ADHD who's lost jobs, relationships, and opportunities isn't experiencing mere difference. They're disabled by their condition. These critics worry that celebrating neurodiversity might minimize the very real need for effective treatment. The neurodiversity response is that recognizing disability doesn't require pathologizing. Someone can be disabled, genuinely limited in their ability to function in society as currently structured, while still being a valuable, fully human person whose brain simply works differently. The disability arises from the mismatch between the person and their environment, not from deficiency in the person. Consider, if you're left-handed in a world designed for right-handed people, you'll face difficulties. We could call this left-handed deficit disorder and try to train everyone to use their right hand. Or we could accommodate left-handedness, provide left-handed scissors, arrange workspaces with consideration for different-handedness. Recognize that some people just work better with their left hand. The neurodiversity paradigm suggests we should take the second approach with neurological differences. Where you come down on this debate might depend partly on your own experiences and values, but what's undeniable is that the neurodiversity framework has given many people with ADHD a less shame-based way to understand themselves. Instead of, I'm lazy and broken, it's, my brain works differently, which creates both challenges and strengths. And that brings us to something crucial that's often missing from conversations about ADHD, the strengths that can come with these different minds. And Part 6. Silver linings, the unexpected strengths of ADHD. In 2023, researchers at the University of Bergen in Norway published a qualitative study exploring the positive experiences of adults living with ADHD. They interviewed 50 adults who were participating in an online intervention trial, asking them to describe not the challenges, but the benefits of their ADHD. 4 themes emerged, and they paint a picture quite different from the typical deficit-focused narrative. The first theme was high energy and a drive to take action. Participants described themselves as energetic, spontaneous, and inclined to try new things. One said, "I enjoy trying new things, and if I do not get it right the first time, I will examine the possibility of trying a simpler method." They saw their tendency toward action, even impulsive action, as sometimes leading to positive outcomes. Their energy could be channeled productively, particularly in situations requiring quick decisions or tolerance for uncertainty. The second theme was an unconventional mind and creativity. This came up repeatedly. Participants described themselves as thinking differently from others, seeing connections and perspectives that neurotypical people might miss. They felt they were naturally creative, solution-oriented, capable of innovation. They attributed this to their brain's tendency to make rapid, unexpected associations. The same tendency that creates distractibility in boring meetings can generate creative insights in problem-solving contexts. Research backs this up, and the findings are quite specific. Multiple studies have found that people with ADHD perform better on measures of divergent thinking, the ability to generate many different ideas from a single starting point. In a study published in Personality and Individual Differences in 2015, college students with ADHD scored higher than non-ADHD peers on tasks requiring conceptual expansion and overcoming knowledge constraints. When asked to invent names for new products without using patterns from examples provided, ADHD participants were significantly less constrained by those examples. They broke the rules more readily. When asked to draw alien creatures unlike any Earth animal, their creations were rated as more original, showing less constraint from conventional biological assumptions. The lead researcher, Holly White, interpreted this as evidence that ADHD involves reduced constraint from existing knowledge. What she called leaky attention could actually be a feature in creative contexts, where neurotypical people might automatically think, "This is how things are usually done." People with ADHD are less bound by convention. This cognitive style creates challenges when you need to follow established procedures, but it becomes an advantage in contexts requiring innovation and original thinking. There's also hyperfocus, which we've mentioned before. The Norwegian study identified this as both challenge and strength, a double-edged trait. When directed toward useful tasks, hyperfocus enables extraordinary productivity and achievement. One participant described completing educational courses and job assignments with remarkable efficiency when they could enter a hyperfocus state. Many adults with ADHD describe being able to accomplish in a few hours of hyperfocus what might take neurotypical workers days of steady effort. The challenge, of course, is that you can't always control what captures hyperfocus. But when you can align your hyperfocus capacity with meaningful work, it becomes a powerful asset. The fourth theme was resilience and growth. Participants described how coping with the challenges of ADHD throughout their lives had fostered resilience, adaptability, and empathy. They felt they'd developed problem-solving skills and emotional strength from navigating difficulties. Many felt their struggles made them more compassionate toward others facing challenges. This was particularly true for those in education and healthcare. One teacher noted, "As a teacher, ADHD helps me to understand students that have a learning disability. This pattern of finding strength through adversity isn't unique to ADHD, but it's a reminder that focusing only on deficits misses important aspects of these individuals' experiences and capacities." Beyond these subjective reports, there's emerging evidence for specific cognitive advantages. The same brain differences that create executive function challenges may also confer benefits. Pattern recognition is one. The ADHD brain's tendency to scan the environment constantly, picking up on multiple stimuli, can create overwhelming distractibility. But it can also mean noticing patterns, details, and connections that others miss. Some research suggests enhanced visual spatial abilities in some ADHD populations. Rapid idea generation is another. The ADHD brain operates at a fast pace, making connections quickly. In brainstorming contexts or creative work, this can be valuable. You might not filter or organize these ideas well. That's an executive function task, but you can generate them prolifically. High energy and enthusiasm, when channeled appropriately, can be contagious and motivating. Many people with ADHD describe being natural leaders in contexts that value energy, enthusiasm, and unconventional thinking. There's also some evidence that ADHD may be associated with entrepreneurship. The willingness to take risks, the ability to hyper-focus on a passion project, the creative problem-solving, the high energy. These traits can serve entrepreneurs well. Not all people with ADHD entrepreneurs, and not all entrepreneurs have ADHD, but there's interesting overlap. Now, we should be clear, these strengths don't negate the challenges. Having creative potential doesn't make it easy to organize your life or remember appointments. Hyperfocus is useless if you can't focus on the things you actually need to do. Resilience developed through struggle is real, but it would be better not to need quite so much resilience in the first place. The point isn't that ADHD is all wonderful and we should celebrate it uncritically. The point is that the ADHD cognitive style comes with a package of traits, some challenging and some potentially advantageous, and that context matters enormously in determining whether those traits become disabilities or assets. In a modern office job requiring sustained attention to boring details, consistent meeting attendance, and meticulous organization, ADHD traits are largely disadvantageous. In a creative field with variable tasks, flexible structure, and room for unconventional thinking, some of those same traits might be advantages. This is why the neurodiversity approach emphasizes both supporting individuals with strategies and accommodations, and changing environments to be more inclusive of different cognitive styles. Both are needed. But for individuals with ADHD, particularly those who've spent years believing they're fundamentally flawed, recognizing that their different brain also comes with strengths can be profoundly important for self-esteem and identity. The question becomes, how do we manage the challenges while leveraging the strengths? And that brings us to treatment. Part 7. Treating ADHD. The medication story. Let's talk about treatment, starting with what research shows is most effective: medication. ADHD medications have been used for over 80 years. The first reports of stimulants helping children with attention and behavior problems date to the 1930s. Decades of research have established their efficacy and safety profile more thoroughly than almost any other psychiatric medication. The most common medications fall into two categories: stimulants and non-stimulants. Stimulant medications include methylphenidate, brand names include Ritalin, Concerta, and newer formulations like Azstarys, and amphetamines, including mixed amphetamine salts sold as Adderall and lisdexamfetamine sold as Vyvanse. These work by increasing the availability of dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain, particularly in the prefrontal cortex and other regions involved in executive function and attention. The mechanism isn't completely understood, but the current theory suggests that by increasing dopamine signaling, stimulants strengthen the brain's executive control systems. They improve signal-to-noise ratio in neural circuits, making it easier to focus on relevant information and filter out distractions. They enhance working memory capacity. They improve impulse control by strengthening inhibitory circuits. Non-stimulant medications include atomoxetine, marketed as Strattera, which is a norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. There are also guanfacine and clonidine, originally blood pressure medications, which affect norepinephrine signaling through a different mechanism. And bupropion, an antidepressant that affects dopamine and norepinephrine, is sometimes used off-label for ADHD. So what does the evidence say about effectiveness? A massive network meta-analysis published in The Lancet Psychiatry in 2018 analyzed 133 randomized controlled trials, including over 18,000 participants across all age groups. For adults, the findings were clear. All medications except modafinil were more efficacious than placebo for treating ADHD core symptoms, at least in the short term. Amphetamines showed the largest effect sizes, followed by methylphenidate and atomoxetine. In practical terms, this means amphetamines produced the most significant symptom improvement on average, but individual response varies. What works best for one person might not work best for another. A 2025 follow-up study, also in The Lancet Psychiatry, looked specifically at adults and included both pharmacological and non-pharmacological interventions. It found that stimulants were the only intervention supported by evidence from both self-reported and clinician-reported measures of ADHD symptom reduction. Atomoxetine also showed efficacy, but had worse tolerability. More people stopped taking it due to side effects. Survey data from ADHD magazine, published in 2024, provides real-world perspective. Over 11,000 adults with ADHD and caregivers participated. Key findings: people with ADHD rated medication as more effective than any other treatment approach. However, it typically takes trying multiple medications to find one that works. Adults tried an average of 2.56 different prescriptions before finding an effective one. 17% of children and 14% of adults in the survey discontinued medication at some point. Reasons included side effects, cost, access issues, or feeling they didn't need it anymore. Common side effects of stimulants include appetite suppression, sleep difficulties, increased heart rate and blood pressure, headaches, irritability, and anxiety. For some people, these side effects are manageable or diminish over time. For others, they're intolerable, leading to medication discontinuation. Non-stimulants generally have different side effect profiles. Atomoxetine commonly causes nausea, fatigue, and decreased appetite. Guanfacine and clonidine can cause sedation and low blood pressure. There are also concerns about long-term effects, particularly with stimulants. Do they affect growth in children? Do they increase cardiovascular risk? Do they affect personality or creativity? The research has been somewhat reassuring. Height effects are small and may resolve over time. Cardiovascular effects are generally minor in healthy individuals, though they require monitoring in people with pre-existing heart conditions. Effects on personality and creativity are more complex and individual. Some people feel more themselves on medication, others feel dampened. Here's something interesting. A study by Boot and colleagues in 2017 found that while ADHD medications might influence creativity task performance, the effects varied by type of creativity task and weren't uniformly negative. Some adults report their creativity feels unchanged or even enhanced on medication because they can actually complete creative projects instead of just having scattered ideas. Others feel their thinking is less free and associative on medication. Individual experience varies widely. The efficacy of medication is well established for short-term symptom control. What's less clear is long-term outcomes. Most medication studies last weeks or months, not years or decades. We have limited high-quality data on how medication affects life outcomes over the long term: career success, relationship stability, overall well-being. The evidence we do have suggests benefits, but more research is needed. One crucial point: medication doesn't cure ADHD. It manages symptoms while it's in your system. When it wears off, symptoms return. For most people, this means taking medication daily, sometimes multiple times per day for short-acting formulations. It's disease management, not disease modification. Also important, medication doesn't address everything. It can improve attention, impulse control, and working memory. It generally doesn't teach you organizational skills, time management strategies, or emotional regulation techniques. You still need to learn those things. This is why most experts recommend multimodal treatment, combining medication with behavioral interventions. Not everyone responds to medication, and not everyone wants to take it. Concerns about side effects, stigma, cost, or philosophical objections to medication lead some people to seek alternatives. And this brings us to non-pharmacological treatments. Part 8. Beyond medication, therapy, coaching, and skills training. While medication is the most effective single intervention for ADHD symptom reduction, it's not the only option, and for many people, it's not sufficient on its own. The most studied non-pharmacological treatment is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, specifically adapted for adult ADHD. This isn't the same as CBT for depression or anxiety. ADHD-specific CBT focuses on practical skills, organization systems, time management techniques, breaking tasks into steps, addressing procrastination, and modifying unhelpful thought patterns specific to ADHD. The cognitive component addresses thoughts like, "I'm lazy," or "I'll never be able to do this." These thoughts are common in people with ADHD, often after years of struggling and internalizing negative messages. CBT helps people recognize that their difficulties stem from executive dysfunction, not moral failing, and develop more compassionate, realistic self-talk. The behavioral component teaches concrete strategies, using planners and reminders, creating structured routines, minimizing distractions, breaking large tasks into smaller steps, and building in rewards for task completion. What does research say about CBT effectiveness? A randomized trial published in the Journal of Attention Disorders in the Teen compared group CBT plus medication versus group CBT alone in 88 adults with ADHD. The combined treatment showed greater improvements in ADHD symptoms, organizational skills, and self-esteem immediately after treatment. However, during follow-up, the differences diminished as the CBT alone group continued improving while the combined group maintained but didn't further improve. This suggests CBT has lasting effects that build over time, while medication provides more immediate relief. The combination may be optimal for many people. Medication provides symptom control while they learn and implement new skills through CBT. A 2025 meta-analysis in The Lancet Psychiatry found that CBT, neurofeedback, and relaxation therapy showed some efficacy for ADHD symptoms. But the effects were often seen only on clinician ratings, not patient self-reports. This discrepancy is interesting and suggests we need more research to understand when and for whom these interventions work. ADHD coaching is another popular intervention. Unlike therapy, which addresses mental health and psychological issues, coaching focuses on practical life management. A coach helps you develop systems for organization, time management, and task completion. They provide accountability, helping you follow through on intentions. They work with you to identify your specific challenges and develop personalized strategies. Research on coaching is more limited than on medication or CBT, but what exists suggests it can be helpful, particularly for high-functioning adults who need practical support more than mental health treatment. Mindfulness-based interventions have also been studied. Mindfulness training teaches present-moment awareness and attention control, which would seem relevant for ADHD. Some studies have found that mindfulness training reduces ADHD symptoms and improves attention, though effect sizes are generally smaller than for medication or CBT. Dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, originally developed for borderline personality disorder, has been adapted for ADHD with a focus on emotion regulation skills, distress tolerance, and mindfulness. Given that emotional dysregulation is common in ADHD, this makes theoretical sense, though research is limited. Psychoeducation, simply learning about ADHD, can itself be therapeutic. Understanding that your struggles stem from a neurodevelopmental condition rather than personal failure can reduce shame and self-blame. Learning what ADHD is and how it affects you can help you make sense of your life history and develop self-compassion. Neurofeedback, training to modify brainwave patterns, has been promoted for ADHD, but the evidence is mixed. Some studies show modest benefits, others show no advantage over placebo. It's time-intensive and expensive, and current evidence doesn't support it as a first-line treatment. Lifestyle interventions matter too. Exercise improves ADHD symptoms, likely through effects on brain chemistry and executive function. Regular physical activity is one of the few interventions recommended by essentially every ADHD expert. Sleep is crucial. ADHD and sleep problems have a bidirectional relationship. ADHD disrupts sleep, and poor sleep worsens ADHD symptoms. Addressing sleep hygiene, and sometimes treating sleep disorders like sleep apnea or delayed sleep phase syndrome that are more common in ADHD populations, can significantly improve functioning. Diet is controversial. Some people report that dietary changes, eliminating artificial colors, reducing sugar, eating more protein, help their symptoms. Research evidence for most dietary interventions is weak. However, ensuring adequate nutrition, stable blood sugar, and sufficient protein seems reasonable, given their importance for brain function. Organizational systems and environmental modifications are essential. Using calendars, reminders, and apps. Creating dedicated workspaces that minimize distractions. Breaking tasks into smaller steps. Building structure into your day. These aren't treatments in the medical sense, but they're crucial accommodations that help people with ADHD function better. The multimodal approach recognizes that ADHD affects multiple domains of life, and that addressing it requires multiple interventions. Medication can improve brain chemistry and symptom control. Therapy can teach skills and address psychological impacts. Coaching can provide practical support. Lifestyle changes can optimize overall brain function. Environmental accommodations can reduce daily friction. Different people need different combinations. Someone with mild ADHD might do fine with organizational systems and coaching. Someone with severe ADHD might need medication, therapy, coaching, and significant accommodations. The key is comprehensive assessment and individualized treatment planning. And increasingly, this includes workplace accommodations, which can make the difference between thriving and struggling in one's career. Part 9. ADHD in the workplace, accommodations and advocacy. For many adults, work is where ADHD symptoms become most problematic. Modern work environments, open offices with constant distractions, long meetings, detailed paperwork, strict deadlines, multitasking demands, are often poorly suited to the ADHD brain. The good news is that workplace accommodations for ADHD are legally protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act in the United States and similar legislation in other countries. The ADA defines disability as a condition that substantially limits one or more major life activities. For many people, ADHD meets this threshold. To request accommodations, you need to disclose your diagnosis to your employer and provide documentation from a healthcare provider. This can feel risky. There's still stigma around mental health conditions, and some people worry about discrimination. However, once disclosed, the law requires employers to engage in an interactive process to determine reasonable accommodations. What does reasonable mean? It means accommodations that don't create undue hardship for the employer, excessive cost, or operational difficulty. Most ADHD accommodations are low cost or free. Common effective accommodations include flexible work schedules. Many people with ADHD have peak productivity times that don't align with standard 9-to-5 schedules. Being able to work when you're most alert and focused can dramatically improve performance. Remote work options. Working from home can reduce distractions, eliminate commute stress, and allow people to structure their environment optimally. Quiet workspace or noise-canceling headphones. Open offices are notoriously difficult for people with ADHD. Having a private office, cubicle with walls, or permission to work in a quiet area can help. When that's not possible, noise-canceling headphones can reduce auditory distractions. Written instructions and documentation. Instead of just verbal instructions, providing written documentation allows people to review information multiple times and reduces demands on working memory. Extended deadlines or project management support. Breaking large projects into smaller milestones with interim deadlines can help with task initiation and completion. Having a manager or colleague who checks in regularly can provide external structure. Task variety and minimization of repetitive work. Many people with ADHD function better when work is varied and interesting. Restructuring job duties to minimize boring repetitive tasks and maximize engaging novel work can improve performance. Frequent breaks. Short breaks to move around can help manage restlessness and reset attention. Assistive technology. Apps for task management, calendar reminders, focus tools like website blockers during work time, and speech-to-text software can all help. Modified meeting schedules. Providing agendas in advance, allowing breaks during long meetings, or permitting remote attendance can make meetings more accessible. The interactive process means employers and employees work together to identify what accommodations would be helpful. The employee knows their needs, the employer knows operational constraints, and together they find solutions. Research from the Job Accommodation Network found that the majority of workplace accommodations cost nothing, and those that do have costs typically cost under $500 one time. The benefits include improved productivity, reduced turnover, and better employee morale. Accommodation isn't charity, it's good business. But accommodations alone aren't enough. Organizations benefit from broader cultural shifts toward neurodiversity inclusion. This means educating managers and co-workers about ADHD, reducing stigma, and recognizing that different people work effectively in different ways. Some people with ADHD find that choosing ADHD-friendly careers makes a bigger difference than accommodations. Jobs that provide novelty, variety, stimulation, clear immediate feedback, and room for creativity often suit ADHD brains better than highly structured, detail-oriented, repetitive roles. Entrepreneurship appeals to some because of the autonomy, variety, and ability to structure work around their own cognitive style. Creative fields, writing, design, arts, can leverage ADHD strengths. Emergency response roles, paramedic, emergency room physician, can suit people who thrive in high-stakes, fast-paced environments. Teaching, particularly in dynamic classroom settings, can work well for people with high energy and creativity. The key is matching role demands to cognitive strengths and minimizing demands that require constant use of impaired executive functions. Of course, not everyone has the luxury of choosing an ideal career, and many jobs require skills that are challenging for ADHD brains. This is where accommodations, strategies, and support become crucial. One final note on workplace issues. Disclosure is a personal decision with no universally right answer. Disclosing gives you access to legal protections and accommodations, but also risks discrimination despite legal protections. Some people choose to disclose, others don't. Some disclose only after they've proven themselves and built social capital. The decision depends on factors like workplace culture, severity of symptoms, relationship with management, and personal comfort. What's essential is that people with ADHD have options, legal protections if they choose to disclose, and strategies to manage symptoms even if they don't. Part 10. Living well with ADHD. Practical wisdom beyond formal treatment and workplace accommodations Living well with ADHD requires developing personal strategies, self-awareness, and often a fundamental shift in self-perception. Time management is consistently cited as one of the biggest challenges. Time blindness, difficulty sensing the passage of time or accurately estimating duration, is common in ADHD. This makes it hard to know how long tasks will take, to pace yourself, to know when to start getting ready for an appointment. Strategies that help include extreme externalization of time. Use timers constantly. Set alarms not just for appointments, but for when to start getting ready for appointments. Use visual timers that show time passing. Build in buffer time. If something takes an hour, plan for 90 minutes. Accept that you'll likely be bad at estimating time and compensate with external tools. For task management, the key is reducing working memory load. Write everything down immediately. Use a single, reliable system for capturing tasks, whether it's a specific app, a notebook, or a particular calendar. Don't trust yourself to remember things. You'll forget. And that's not a moral failing, it's working memory limitation. Breaking tasks into smallest possible steps helps with initiation. Don't write taxes on your to-do list. That's overwhelming. Write Find Tax folder, open tax software, enter W-2 info, making each step small enough that starting feels possible. Building routines reduces the executive function cost of daily life. When behaviors become habitual, they require less conscious effort. Put your keys in the same place every single time. Have a morning routine you follow in the same order. Automate as much as possible. Automatic bill pay, meal planning routines, standard weekly schedules. For managing overwhelm, which is common when multiple demands pile up, some strategies include externalizing everything swirling in your head by writing it all down, prioritizing ruthlessly by identifying the one or two things that truly must happen today, asking for help instead of trying to do everything alone, and recognizing when you're hitting your limit and need to pause. Emotional regulation strategies are crucial for many adults with ADHD. Techniques borrowed from DBT can help, naming emotions to create distance from them, using opposite action when emotions prompt unhelpful behaviors, and building a life worth living so you're not constantly operating from crisis mode. Self-compassion may be the most important skill of all. People with ADHD typically have harsh inner critics developed from years of criticism and failure. Learning to speak to yourself with kindness, the way you'd speak to a friend, can be transformative. This doesn't mean making excuse, but it means acknowledging that you're trying hard, that your brain works differently, and that struggling with certain things doesn't make you a bad person. Building community matters enormously. Connecting with other people who have ADHD, whether through support groups, online communities, or friendships, provides validation, shared strategies, and the relief of being understood. There's deep comfort in talking with someone who immediately gets what it's like when everyone else seems to navigate effortlessly what you find impossibly hard. Relationships require attention. ADHD affects romantic relationships, friendships, and family dynamics. Common issues include forgotten plans or promises, emotional dysregulation leading to conflict, hyperfocus on interests to the exclusion of partners, and difficulty with household management. Open communication about ADHD and its effects can help. Partners need to understand that forgetting an anniversary isn't about not caring. It's about working memory and time management difficulties. Developing systems together, shared calendars, regular check-ins, division of labor that plays to each person's strengths, can reduce friction. Therapy specifically addressing relationship issues in the context of ADHD can be valuable, helping couples or families develop understanding and strategies. For parents with ADHD raising children, there's added complexity. ADHD is highly heritable, so your children may have it too. Managing your own ADHD while providing structure for children requires extra support. On the flip side, some parents find that addressing their own ADHD improves their parenting. They're calmer, more organized, more present. Throughout all of this, the goal isn't perfection or becoming neurotypical. The goal is functioning well enough to build a life you find meaningful and satisfying, managing challenges effectively, and leveraging your strengths. Many adults with ADHD describe a journey from diagnosis through grief and anger, to acceptance, and finally, to integration, where ADHD becomes part of your identity, but not your entire identity. You're not just your ADHD, but acknowledging and working with your neurology rather than fighting it becomes part of how you navigate the world. Part 11. The twist. What if we've been asking the wrong question? Throughout this exploration, we've examined ADHD through multiple lenses: clinical diagnosis, executive dysfunction, late discovery, comorbidity, neurodiversity, strengths, and treatment. But now, as we near the end, I want to share something that might reframe everything we've discussed. What if the entire way we've been thinking about ADHD is backwards? Here's what I mean. We've been asking, what's wrong with ADHD brains? How can we fix them? How can we help these people cope with their deficits? But consider this radical reinterpretation of the same evidence. ADHD brains aren't failing at being neurotypical. They're succeeding at being different. The symptoms aren't glitches, they're features. Not features that work well in all environments, but features nonetheless. Think about what we've learned. The distractibility that makes classrooms unbearable is the same mechanism that allows noticing subtle patterns others miss. The impulsivity that creates social difficulties is the same quick reaction capacity that enables rapid decision-making. The inability to sustain attention on boring tasks is paired with the ability to hyper-focus with extraordinary intensity on compelling ones. The executive dysfunction that makes daily life chaotic comes with creative, non-linear thinking that generates novel solutions. Research by Holly White and colleagues, published in 2015 in Personality and Individual Differences, found something striking. Adults with ADHD show enhanced creative thinking precisely because they have difficulty filtering out irrelevant information. What neurotypical brains automatically suppress as distraction, ADHD brains continue to process, and sometimes those distractions contain the seeds of creative insight. Their study demonstrated that the same leaky attention that causes problems in structured settings can enhance creative performance in appropriate contexts. Here's the twist. ADHD isn't a broken neurotypical brain. It's a brain optimized for a different kind of environment and a different set of tasks. The tragedy isn't the ADHD brain, it's the mismatch between that brain and modern societal demands. Imagine if our society were designed around ADHD brains instead. What if schools valued creative exploration over sustained attention to standardized curricula? What if workplaces rewarded innovative thinking and rapid task switching over sitting quietly at desks for 8 hours? What if social systems accommodated forgetfulness with built-in redundancy rather than punishing it? In that world, neurotypical people might be the ones diagnosed with a disorder. Routine preference disorder, characterized by difficulty generating novel ideas, excessive focus on rules and procedures, inability to rapidly shift attention, and tendency toward conventional thinking. That sounds absurd, right? But it reveals something important. What counts as disordered depends entirely on what environment you're in and what that environment demands. This is why the research on workplace accommodations is so powerful. When you give people with ADHD environments that work with their cognition, flexible schedules, varied tasks, stimulating work, minimal boring routine, many thrive. The disorder diminishes not because the brain changed, but because the environment did. The same person who struggles catastrophically in a traditional office might excel as an entrepreneur, an emergency room physician, a creative director, a software developer working on novel problems. The difference isn't treatment or willpower, it's environmental fit. Here's what this reframing means. The goal isn't to make ADHD brains more like neurotypical brains. The goal is to recognize that human cognitive diversity exists, that different brain types have different strengths and needs, and that a healthy society should accommodate that diversity rather than demanding everyone conform to a single cognitive template. This doesn't mean ADHD isn't challenging. It absolutely is, particularly in current societal structures. It doesn't mean people shouldn't seek treatment. Medication, therapy, and strategies can dramatically improve quality of life. It doesn't mean we should romanticize genuine suffering. What it does mean is that the fundamental problem isn't the ADHD brain. It's a society built exclusively around neurotypical functioning, and then calling everyone else disordered when they struggle in that environment. The research on evolutionary perspectives, on ADHD strengths, on neurodiversity, all of it points to the same conclusion. ADHD might not be pathology. It might be diversity. And that changes everything about how we should approach it. Part 12. What we're still learning. Even with this paradigm shift, it's worth acknowledging how much remains unknown about ADHD and how the science continues to evolve. We still don't fully understand the neurobiology. The dopamine hypothesis is compelling but incomplete. Serotonin, norepinephrine, and other neurotransmitter systems are likely involved. The exact nature of brain differences in structure, function, and connectivity, and how they produce the symptom profile remains an active area of research. We need better understanding of ADHD across the lifespan. Most research focuses on children, with adults understudied. How does ADHD change as people age into middle and older adulthood? How do symptoms interact with age-related cognitive changes? We're just beginning to explore these questions. We need more research on treatment. While short-term medication efficacy is established, long-term outcomes need more study. For non-pharmacological treatments, we need larger, better-designed trials. We need to understand for whom different treatments work best, personalized medicine rather than one-size-fits-all approaches. The genetic basis of ADHD is complex. It's highly heritable. If you have ADHD, your children have roughly 50% chance of having it. But it's polygenic, involving many genes of small effect rather than a single ADHD gene. Gene-environment interactions likely matter. We're far from genetic testing for ADHD, though research continues. The relationship between ADHD and other conditions needs clarification. Why does ADHD so commonly co-occur with anxiety, depression, autism, learning disabilities, and sleep disorders? Are these truly separate conditions, or are we dealing with dimensional traits that cluster in various ways? Should our diagnostic system change to reflect this complexity? Environmental factors deserve more attention. Genetics account for roughly 70 to 80% of ADHD risk, but that leaves 20 to 30% for environmental factors. Prenatal exposures, early life stress, educational experiences. How do these interact with genetic vulnerability? We need more research on women with ADHD, on racial and ethnic minorities, on different cultural contexts. Much of what we know comes from studies of white boys and men in Western countries. ADHD exists across all populations, but its expression and impacts may vary by culture, gender, and context in ways we're only beginning to understand. The neurodiversity paradigm itself requires ongoing dialogue and research. How do we balance recognition of difference with acknowledgement of disability and need for support? How do we determine which interventions genuinely help people thrive versus pressuring them to conform to neurotypical norms? These are philosophical as much as scientific questions, but they matter for how we approach ADHD clinically and socially. What we do know is this: ADHD is real. It significantly impacts people's lives, and effective treatments exist. Understanding, compassion, and appropriate support can dramatically improve outcomes. The narrative is shifting from pure deficit to recognition of both challenges and strengths. And increasingly, we're recognizing that neurodiversity isn't about some brains being broken. It's about natural variation in how minds can be organized and operate. Conclusion: the wholeness of different minds. So here we are, at the end of this long exploration. And if you've stayed with me through all of this, you've witnessed something remarkable, a complete reframing of what ADHD means. We started with the devastating moment of late diagnosis, that shattering realization that 40 years of self-blame were based on a fundamental misunderstanding. We walked through the clinical picture, the lost girls phenomenon, the executive dysfunction, the comorbidities. We examined treatments that work and accommodations that help. But then came the twist, the realization that we've been asking the wrong question all along. The question isn't, what's wrong with ADHD brains? The question is, how can we build a world that works for cognitive diversity? ADHD is real. It causes genuine struggles in modern environments. People with ADHD deserve and need support, treatment, and understanding. But ADHD is also part of the natural spectrum of human cognition. It's not a broken neurotypical brain. It's a different kind of brain, with different strengths and different needs. In the right environments, some of those differences become advantages. We looked at why diagnosis comes so late for so many, especially women. The masking, the misunderstanding, the years of internalized shame. We explored executive function as the hidden architecture beneath ADHD symptoms. We examined the constellation of comorbid conditions that so often accompany ADHD. Then we shifted our entire frame of reference. Through the neurodiversity paradigm, through evolutionary perspectives, through research on ADHD's strengths, we saw that these brains aren't malfunctioning. They're functioning differently. The creativity that emerges from less filtered thinking, the hyper-focus that enables extraordinary achievement, the resilience built through adversity, the innovative problem-solving that comes from not being constrained by conventional approaches. These aren't compensations for ADHD, they're part of the ADHD cognitive profile. We explored treatments, medications that help many people, therapies that teach skills, accommodations that reduce environmental mismatch. But we also recognized that the goal isn't to eliminate ADHD or make everyone neurotypical. It's to support people in building meaningful lives that work with their neurology, not against it. And finally, we arrived at the revelation that changes everything. The problem isn't ADHD brains. The problem is a society designed exclusively for one type of brain, then labeling everyone else as disordered. Remember that 43-year-old woman from the opening, hearing, "You have ADHD" for the first time? That moment wasn't just about getting a diagnosis. It was about discovering that she'd spent 4 decades trying to operate Windows software on Mac hardware, blaming herself every time there was a compatibility error. The truth is, her brain wasn't defective. It was different. And in the right environment, with the right support, with self-understanding and appropriate accommodations, that different brain can do remarkable things. This is true for everyone with ADHD. You're not broken. You're not lazy. You're not failing at being neurotypical. You were never meant to be neurotypical in the first place. Your brain is part of human cognitive diversity. It comes with challenges, absolutely, but it also comes with potential that neurotypical brains simply don't have. The distractibility that makes meetings unbearable might be the same sensitivity that makes you notice what others miss. The impulsivity that gets you in trouble might be the same rapid processing that generates insights others work years to achieve. The executive dysfunction that makes organization difficult might be paired with creative, non-linear thinking that solves problems no one else could see. For society, this means we have work to do. We need to improve diagnostic practices so people aren't suffering for decades before discovery. We need to reduce stigma and increase understanding. We need to build more inclusive workplaces, schools, and systems that work for cognitive diversity, not just for one narrow type of brain. We need to stop asking, how do we fix these people? And start asking, how do we build environments where different kinds of minds can thrive? Because ADHD has been part of human neurology since we were living in small groups on the African savanna. Different minds, different cognitive styles, different ways of processing reality. This is how we've always been. What's new isn't ADHD. What's new is our growing understanding that diversity in neurology, like diversity in everything else about humans, makes us richer, more capable, more creative as a species. Perfection was never the goal. Wholeness is. And wholeness means accepting that some brains work differently, that those differences create both challenges and gifts, that the same traits that make you struggle in one context might make you excel in another. You are not your diagnosis, but your diagnosis is part of who you are. Understanding it can free you from decades of misplaced blame. Managing it can transform your quality of life. And recognizing that you're part of human neurodiversity can help you move from shame to acceptance to something deeper. The recognition that different isn't broken, it's just different. The ADHD brain is not a failed neurotypical brain. It's an ADHD brain, with its own logic, its own strengths, its own way of experiencing reality. The work isn't to fix it. The work is to understand it, support it, accommodate it, and create space for it to do what it does best. And maybe, just maybe, we'll discover that what we called a disorder was actually a different way of being human. Different, challenging, frustrating, exhausting, yes, but also creative, innovative, resilient, and deeply fundamentally human. The question was never, what's wrong with you? The question is, what do you need to flourish? And that question has answers. Good answers. Hopeful answers. Take a deep breath. If this resonated with you, if you heard your own story here, or understood someone you love a little better, maybe consider giving this video a like. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe if you'd like to continue exploring psychology together in this gentle, thorough way. Most of all, be kind to yourself. Whether you have ADHD or any other way of being different, you deserve compassion, understanding, and the space to be exactly who you are. Rest well. Until next time.